American Civil War is generally thought to have been fought solely over the question of slavery. This was certainly the issue which provoked the final crisis, and the split between the states, when it came, eventually lay for the most part between those which permitted slavery and those which outlawed it. Nevertheless, the real underlying cause of the Civil War was one which had remained unresolved since the Revolution, nearly 100 years earlier. It was the question of sovereignty and the right of each individual state to govern itself as it pleased. Before the Revolution, each of the original 13 states had been a separate colony, administered by its own locally elected council and a royal governor. They were all very different in climate, outlook, character, and even in religion, from the Anglicans in the Deep South to the Puritans in New England. Just one thing, and one thing alone, united them all: a growing resentment of rule from London. And in 1774, each colony sent delegates to a Continental Congress in order to present a united front to the British government. A bitter struggle followed, but once the war was won and the British had been driven into the sea, the colonists still found themselves faced with a very similar problem. Many who fought in the war argued that they had not won independence for their home states only to have them subjected to the authority of Congress instead. Indeed, some went so far as to declare that, given the choice, a return to British rule might be preferable to submitting to the dictates of local politicians. By way of a compromise, therefore, the fledgling United States of America was at first governed by Articles of Confederation, which recognized the independence of the individual states and established a weak central government, responsible for foreign policy and for very little else. This soon proved in practice to be unworkable, and within a short time a new constitution was adopted, which created a much stronger federal government with considerable powers to regulate domestic issues as well. One of these, the issue of slavery, was slow to make itself felt, but when it did, the result was devastating. Most immigrants to the United States landed in the north. Not only were the ports of Boston and New York much more convenient, but newly arrived Europeans also found the climate there preferable to the damp heat of the south. As a result, northern businessmen found a ready supply of cheap labor, and industry flourished.
What's up, YouTube? It's your boy Johnny. Back in here, one more reaction video, ladies and gentlemen. Now, as you just saw in that clip from the complete story of the American Civil War, it said that slavery was not the primary issue that they had in the Civil War. And all we trying to do is figure out this thing called life. And what they be saying, you need to educate yourself. That's what we're trying to do, baby. We're trying to educate ourselves. If this is your first time to the channel, get on in here. As I love to say, we simply spirits encased in human flesh, trying to figure out this thing called life, not nearly as divided or as demonic as the mainstream media tries to make it seem every single day. Now we about to jump into the rise and fall of Jim Crow, episode 1. And if you dig what you hear in this video / documentary / reaction, do me a favor and share it far and wide.
All you gals and boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river.
In 1836, Jim Crow is born. He begins his strange career as a malicious minstrel caricature of a black man, created by a white man to amuse white audiences. Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in little over a decade, that promise was gone, replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
But I tried to lean inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
My dad said, as long as you're living in this South, you're going to have to go to the back door in this town. Now, you just settled for that. He said, but one thing I want you to swear and promise to me, that you will never get used to it.
I'm not ashamed of the segregated and Jim Crow experience, all because we were able to devise techniques for survival that permitted us to abide our time and to wait until our change comes.
As most blacks were willing to bide their time, some began to fight back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they embarked on an uncertain campaign to secure voting rights, build their own communities, schools, businesses, and churches, and to demand redress against mob violence and lynching. The white supremacists fought back. By 1919, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been a Southern idiosyncrasy, became a national ideology. White supremacy, the power behind Jim Crow, appeared invincible. And over the next decade, the violence against blacks would grow even more horrific. But black Americans continued to battle, using the power of the press and ultimately the power of the courts to pursue their quest for freedom and equality against racism. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is their story. The story of strong men and women who would never accept the demeaning, threatening, and perilous world of Jim Crow. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is the story of those who, in the face of unending terror, achieved triumphs. Triumphs that would in time make America a better place, not just for themselves, but for all of us. Conflict over black emancipation is as old as the nation. In 1861, the South left the Union rather than remain part of a country that restricted the expansion of slavery. At first, Abraham Lincoln saw the struggle as simply a war to save the nation. But in time, he would recast the Civil War as a war to end slavery.
Y'all see the difference already? Slavery wasn't even important. But we're going to keep going. We're going to show just throughout history why you got to read and think for yourself and how we've always been manipulated and bamboozled by the politicians that are so-called on our side.
January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the Confederate States. 6 months after the South surrendered, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. The federal government had made a promise to the former slaves, these newly freed men and women who knew what they wanted: education and the right to vote, equal rights in the courts, and mostly land.
What is it that your people need now that you're free? Our people need land, and they need tools to work the land. So there we began to see the priority to own our own land.
Every colored man will be a slave and feel himself a slave until he can raise his own bale of cotton and put his own mark upon it and says, "This is mine."
Ownership is key.
Without independence and self-employment, freedom would be meaningless.
Now, as we go through this documentary, I want you to think currently which political party is for freedom and self-employment and which political party is for government handouts.
Peter Hall.
On Edisto Island off the coast of South Carolina, thousands of newly freed blacks were making that dream come true. On land abandoned by their former masters and given to them by the Union Army, they had built schools and churches, established family and community life.
Family and community.
But they had heard rumors that their future was at risk. Lincoln had been assassinated, and a Southerner, Andrew Johnson, was president. Johnson fought to save the Union, but not to free slaves. "This is a country for white men," he said, "and as long as I'm president, it will be a government for white men."
Sometimes I feel
They just get you with the gospel music.
like a mother
Like I'm in church with my grandma.
On October 19th, 1865, a boat carrying a deeply troubled Union general, Oliver O. Howard, slowly made its way toward Edisto. Howard was known as the Christian General, a deeply religious man who hated slavery. He was in charge of the new Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress that year to protect the confiscated lands given to the former slaves. Howard was revered second only to Lincoln by free blacks.
They got the message from the Freedmen's Bureau that the general was coming back, General Oliver O. Howard, who they were expecting to hear nothing but good news from him because he was the man who had told them about how this land now was transferred to them and that they owned it and they didn't have to worry about massa no more and everything. He asked them to gather together at the church on Edisto. So over 2,000 people came from all amongst the oak trees and all back off in the woods and from their shacks and their dirt roads to meet there at the church to hear this new discussion about their land.
I have been sent by the president to tell you that your old masters have been pardoned and their plantations are to be given back to them, and that they would hire blacks to work for them. Lay aside your bitter feelings and be reconciled to them. General Oliver O. Howard.
So people were enraged and people started hollering out, no, ain't no way. No, that ain't what you tell us before. No, sir.
General Howard, why do you take away?
Now, mind you, this is almost 60 plus years before Malcolm X, before the Ballad of the Bullet, where he said, political chumps, you've been bamboozled, you've been had. And we ain't even got into FDR and the New Deal. But just pay attention to how every time we've externally put our faith in the government, how they hit you with a gotcha. Got to be quicker than that.
Our lands, you take them from us who are true, always true to the government. You give them to our all-time enemies. The man who gave me 39 lashes and who stripped and flogged my mother and sister, who keeps land from me well knowing I would not have anything to do with him if I had land of my own. That man I cannot well forgive. A freedman.
Some went into nobody know the trouble we see. And some went into motherless child, and all those things rippled off the sea.
Like a motherless child, a long way from home.
1 year later, in 1866, Congress, recognizing continued Southern resistance to black emancipation, passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing blacks the right to vote and due process of law. The time of Reconstruction had begun, but many whites did not plan on fulfilling the intentions of the new laws. Mississippi passed a black code, giving courts the right to apprentice former slaves, with preference to their former owners.
The Negro is free whether we like it or not. For the purity and progress of both races, they must accept their place in the lower order of things. That place is the cotton fields of the South. Such is the rule of the plantation and the law of God. Governor Benjamin Humphreys.
But blacks did not see themselves trapped in the cotton fields. They used their vote to elect black representatives, sat on juries, and sent their children to school.
What had alarmed the white South during Reconstruction was not evidence of black failure, but evidence of black success.
Aha!
Evidence of black assertion, evidence of black independence, evidence of black advancement, and evidence that black men were learning the uses of political power.
If intimidation would not keep blacks in their place, then violence might. In the same year that Reconstruction began, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, founded the Ku Klux Klan. The image of the Klan in white hoods killing blacks by the light of burning crosses would forever be etched in the American mind.
The way white supremacists made sure that ex-slaves would fall back into place or nearly back into place was terror. Beating people up, burning down their houses, shooting them, just the usual physical mayhem of personal violence.
Although they were beaten into submission and retreat, 1869 offered a glimmer of hope with the election of Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency, and Grant delivered.
And we want to keep all of this in context. Grant was a Republican. Johnson was a Democrat who went back on his word and took the land away from the freed slaves. Just so we keep everything in context, those black individuals that were elected to Congress and all that, they were Republicans. So we just gonna keep everything in the open because we always hear the party switch. So we're gonna watch this documentary and see when exactly did the party switch.
He sent federal troops to the South to counter groups like the Klan. But for the black community, even federal intervention was not enough.
The question of, should we stay at home in the South? Should we stay at home in the United States? Should we move somewhere else to the north? Should we move to the west? Or should we leave the United States entirely?
Feeling trapped and helpless and in need of answers, some turned to an unlikely source, an old man who had been born in slavery.
We needed land for our children. That caused my heart to grieve in sorrow. Pity for my race caused me to work for them. Confidence has perished and faded away. We are going to leave the South. Pap Singleton.
$5.
In 1874, Pap Singleton, a former slave, would lead a group of 300 blacks to Kansas. John Brown struck his first blow against slavery there. God must be in Kansas, and black people wanted to go where God was. No one spoke this call stronger than Sojourner Truth.
I have prayed so long that my people would go to Kansas, and that God would make straight the way before them. This colored people is going to be a people. Do you think God has them robbed and scourged all the days of their life for nothing?
Many of the people saw their promised land, they saw their Jordan River being those places that they had to cross over into, where freedom would be away from those who had basically had their feet on their necks all this time, just like the Pharaoh had done in the Bible. So many of them followed their leaders so that they could have their life to themselves, however they wanted that to be built.
They also believed in the God of Daniel, who was an avenging God. This is the God of the apocalypse, the God of the second coming, the God of the decision of who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell.
But as much as Kansas loomed as a promised land for many blacks, getting there could become a journey through hell. Many would perish from starvation and exposure. One group fell victim to yellow fever, and there was always the fear of murderous whites.
Now, I'm living on the same soil that these individuals had through. It ain't no fear of starvation. I don't have no fear of just being murdered or hung from a tree. Like, you have to acknowledge the advancement. And these people work too hard for me to be getting up every day complaining and crying about who stopped me, what I can and can't do. Believe in yourself, because right now the lights are on, the time to shine.
I saw colored men and women cast themselves to the ground in despair, heard them groan and shout their lamentations. What is to become of these wretched people, God only knows. Here were nearly 500,000, scattered along the banks of the mighty Mississippi, without shelter, without food, with no hope of escaping from their present surrounding, and hardly a chance of
We got
return
hope. We
from
got the
whence they
internet.
came.
We got options. Ain't no
Riverboat
excuses in
captain.
2023.
For those who survived to make it to Kansas, they found a land of hard winters, torrential rains, and violent tornadoes. But through spiritual and emotional conviction, they sustained themselves. And within a few years, over 20 towns would be built.
20
But not all
towns.
blacks thought the answer was to leave the South. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who had become the leading black voice for abolition, opposed any mass exodus.
The country will be told of the hundreds who go to Kansas, but not of the thousands who stay in Mississippi. They will be told of the destitute who require material aid, but not of the multitude who are bravely sustaining themselves where they are. If the people of this country cannot be protected in every state of the Union, the sovereignty of the nation is an empty one, and the power in individual states is greater than the power of the United States.
And that's a very good point right there. Because this whole breakdown against from the North and the South was of states' rights versus government control. Let me know in the comments below how you feel. What's your perspective? Because I'm just trying to learn. No man is your friend, no man is your enemy, but every man is your teacher if you allow them to be. And in a world that doesn't want to have productive conversations, just outshout each other, I'm not with all that. So let me know in the comments below what you've learned and from your perspective of the world, and we can all enlighten each other.
Frederick Douglass.
In 1877, Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes, who had won the election by making a deal for electoral votes from Southern Democrats, pulled federal troops from the South.
Compromise of 1877
had betrayed the former slaves. Reconstruction was over.
So at that point, that's when the Republicans pulled a fast one on the Black Americans. So this is twice now already. The Democrats then took your land, and the Republicans gotten back in power, but they compromised to get in power was to pull the troops out that were in the South to protect you. Just so we keep in shape of what's going on right now.
Whites began to reassert their power over blacks, politically, legally, and economically.
White Democrats?
And nowhere was this change more crushing than for those blacks who were farmers, most of whom were sharecroppers.
Owners controlled their little worlds. So there was no police power, there was no federal power, there was no state power that actually made a difference on the ground. So you had relations of dependency built around obedience and submission. That was the ideology
Kind of like
of
cancel
the
culture
of slavery, obedience and submission.
That sounds a lot like modern day censorship, that if you don't say what YouTube or Facebook wants you to say, then they censor you. You got to be obedient with the language. But let's go back to the Compromise of 1877. So at that time, all black Republicans are disenfranchised out of power in the South. So by 1904, those 200 black congressmen and senators, they're no longer there. And black Americans are not allowed to attend the Democrat National Convention until 1924. And then you get to 1932, and 64% of black Americans start voting Democrat. Just so we keeping a score in front of us to pay attention to when the party switch, if they really switched.
Here was the black man, having very limited education, not knowing how to figure and to read, with the books being kept by the white man who is giving him his supplies to start a crop, and likewise owned the land. When the black man ended up at the end of the year and brought his crop in, the white man immediately arranged to outfigure him.
The man would take your cotton, and then the man at the store, you had credit, he run the books up on you, so you didn't have nothing. You work a whole year and hand pick 40 bales of cotton and come out with nothing.
Frustrated by the unfulfilled promise of emancipation, blacks turned to the next generation, to their children. They believed education would be the key to overcome white dominance. One man would come to symbolize this hope: Booker T. Washington. Born into slavery, Washington had managed to learn to read and write, and at 9 he worked in a salt mine. But within 25 years, Washington had been a student and a teacher at the Hampton Institute, and was invited to be principal of a new school in Alabama. That school was Tuskegee. Arriving in a community of farms and sharecroppers, where attending school was rare, if at all, Washington faced a great challenge: to build a school, attract students, recruit teachers. On July 4th, 1881, in the Zion Hill Baptist Church, the Tuskegee Institute was born. Washington and his 30 recruits believed the only way to one day have their own buildings would be to build them themselves.
The reason that it started as an industrial school was because they had nothing, and so they had to build, grow, and make everything, like harness making, because they needed to have harnesses for the farm animals, carpentry, because they needed to build the buildings, brick masonry, because they needed to make the bricks. These kinds of trades, printing, shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry, all of these things were things that they could use to build a business.
One student who found opportunity at Tuskegee was a young man named William Holtzclaw. His parents, especially his mother, Addie, were passionate about getting an education for their children. They even built their own school.
I remember my parents went into the forest and cut pine poles 8 inches in diameter, split them in half, carried them on their shoulders to a nice shady spot, and built a schoolhouse. There were no floors, no chimneys, and the benches were made of the same material.
Addie Holtzclaw would provide schemes that allowed William and his brother to get an education for most of the year.
The landlord wanted us to pick cotton, but Mother wanted me to remain in school, so she used to outgeneral him by hiding me behind skillets, ovens, and pots. Then she would slip me to school the back way, pushing me through the woods and underbrush until it was safe for me to travel alone.
Whenever someone had wanted to go to school, they would make sure that one of them went and that one stayed at home. Because if they didn't, if both of them were gone, the overseer would come around and would say, "Where are those boys?" And he would get upset. So in order to make sure that that didn't happen, she'd send one to school and leave one at home to do the work. So when the overseer came around and needed someone, she would call them and they would be there.
But the limited education was never going to propel the Holtzclaw children beyond the bondage of sharecropping, where if the landowner didn't cheat you, the weather might.
All bad. Damn.
William Holtzclaw heard about Tuskegee. He wrote Booker T. Washington a letter.
Dear Book, I want to go to Tuskegee to get an education. Can I come?
The letter found its way. Come, Washington replied.
And that's so dope. Now we can just tweet our favorite person. Tweet our college we want to go to.
There before my eyes was a huge pair of mules drawing a machine plow, which to me at the time was a mystery. There were girls cultivating flowers and boys erecting huge brick buildings. Some were hitching horses and driving carriages, while others were milking cows and making cheese. I found some boys studying drawings and others hammering irons, each with an intense earnestness that I had never seen in young men.
When he first got to Tuskegee, he was really amazed that there were so many things he didn't know. He was also amazed as to how they organized the students in the dormitory setting, particularly himself, because he had never slept between 2 sheets. And when he went to the dorm, he was...
Well, think about that. In 2023, how many people we got to walk around saying, I'm oppressed, I'm held back, the white supremacists stopping me. We got a man who never slept between 2 sheets. And he was excited to go to college. You got to start finding things to be grateful for. You got to find the silver lining in every situation. No matter how negative it is, you got to be able to look and see that there's seed of positivity in it, because that's what you need to keep growing.
sleeping, as they say, ready roll. He had all of his clothes on, and someone had to come in and tell him that you have such a thing as a night shirt and a shirt that you wear during the day.
My plan was for them to see not only the utility of labor, but its beauty and dignity. They would be taught how to lift labor up from drudgery and toil, and they would learn to love work for its own sake. We wanted them to return to the plantation districts and show people there how to put new energy and new ideas into farming, as well as the intellectual and moral and religious life of the people. Booker T. Washington.
Washington's vision would bear fruit. In less than a decade, Tuskegee had over 1,000 acres of land, 14 buildings, a farm, and a dozen shops, from a laundry to a blacksmith, with an enrollment of 400 students and 28 teachers. Washington wanted his students at Tuskegee to learn to work, and work hard, no matter how menial the task. He also wanted to keep Southern whites from feeling threatened.
That's why they thought Booker T. Washington was the great godsend, that somehow he'd come forward with an educational philosophy which said in effect that you can educate a people and still keep them subordinate. And he once gave a talk in a speech, and I think it's the most concrete example, where he was given the talk, and actually he was asked this question by a white farmer. He says, why should I send Mandy to Tuskegee to learn how to cook when she can spit in a skillet and know whether it's hot? And Washington's response was, the purpose of industrial education is to teach her not to spit in the skillet, not to teach her to be something other than a cook, but to be a better cook, to be a better sharecropper, to be a better mine worker. And so whites really, thought this is a godsend. We've now come up with a philosophy of education that can keep people in their place and even teach them to be better within their place. And they thought that that was possible. They learned very quickly that that was not possible.
At the Haynes School in Augusta, Georgia, its founder, Lucy Laney, would expand Washington's philosophy of teaching and take it in a different direction. She insisted upon developing her children's full potential. Her students studied English, mathematics, history, chemistry, physics, psychology, sociology, French, and German. What we need to develop, Laney said, is minds, not hands, race leaders, not followers. Laney was especially interested in training young black women to be teachers.
The educated Negro woman is needed in the schoolroom, not only in the kindergarten and primary school, but in the high school and the college. She may give advice and knowledge that will change a whole community and start its people on the upward way.
African-American women were playing a much more critical role than what was common in American education generally. They were critical as educational leaders, but even within the trenches in local communities.
I hope this helps you understand the concept of the black woman as the backbone and why there's such a push of female rap stars right now. Cardi B, Lotto, Danny Lee, Megan Thee Stallion, City Girls. Understand the influence that they have had and continue to have over the masses.
In terms of fundraising and teaching and support groups, that you cannot really understand the development of African-American education without really appreciating the leadership of African-American women.
Teaching was a very important profession for black women in this period of time. It was not just a profession, but it was a mission to uplift African Americans, to teach people to read, to also teach them the ways of this world as free people.
But black teachers had to show real ingenuity. Black schools were often barren affairs with few books, maps, pencils, or pens.
We had students draw the national flag on the blackboard. These flags were assigned a place of honor on the board and became a permanent picture in the room for years. Pupils were careful not to erase the flag when they erased the blackboard.
You know, something I'm grabbing about watching this documentary is that the people before us had a lot of faith in God, and they really valued their nation. Not that that nation was ever loyal to them or treated them fair. It shows so far in this documentary that both political parties did them wrong, but they stayed loyal to their country, something that we don't have in today's society. We don't have a strong connection to Christ, to nothing. You know, you got to believe in something higher than yourself, a bigger power. Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave.
The positive image of Laney and others was hopeful, but the reality for most blacks was hard, back-breaking work and servitude.
I've been a factory hand, janitor, and porter, and butler, and wiping engines on the railroad. I worked as a helper for a carpenter and laying bricks for masons. I've been a driver of teams, a pick and shovel man, and drove steel for a section boss. I was a hand on the Mississippi and working in a steel foundry, and seemed like I did 100 more jobs.
My grandma would work in the tub washing the clothes of the prominent white people of our city. And for all of that washing, for the whole white family, washing and then ironing, she got $1.50 for the whole family laundry.
And
at
I
the end
forgot
of it.
about an iron
So there were
board and
several
an iron.
families that
Gosh.
she had, but it was just $1.50 for all
With Stay
that
Flow
work.
starch, you got your jeans,
White folks
stand
didn't
up
have
on
no
their own.
feeling for you. They pretended they did. They had nannies to give their child comfort. That was my name, Nanny. They would teach their children they were better than you. You was giving them all that love, and you'd hear them say, "You're not supposed to love Nanny. Nanny's a nigger." And they would say it so nasty till it would cut your heart out almost, and you couldn't say a mumbling word. A woman knows how to shift a smile when the burden is so heavy. Know how to smile when she want to cry. Smile when sorrow done touch her so deeply. So that's why I feel black women in the field had to pray and had to moan and had to cry. Them prayers went a long way and protected a lot of people. And God wiped away those tears. And the next morning, we had the strength to go on.
And as I've said time and time again, society takes advantage of broken people. They know your trauma, they know your pain, they know where you tender it, and they want you in a state of anxiety and depression and feeling bad. So you gotta move on from those wounds, the same wounds that they've been picking at forever, of racism, of sexism, of the trauma of black women, the trauma of black women, men, the saying the white man is a problem. Until we maturely heal from these wounds, somebody will always be able to manipulate them to serve their agenda, not yours.
Dorothy Bolden.
Shout out to my strong women, though.
But despite all the obstacles, blacks began to rise.
Propaganda is powerful.
More blacks were being educated. There was now a growing black middle class. And the children of the former slaves were not too quick to bow down to the white man as their parents had.
Whites perceived a new generation of black Southerners, the sons and the daughters and the grandsons and granddaughters of the former slaves, who had not been disciplined by slavery, who had never known slavery, who were perceived as much more restless and obviously much more threatening because, unlike some of their parents and grandparents, they seemed less afraid of whites.
We are not the Negro from whom the chains of slavery fell a quarter of a century ago. Most assuredly not. We are now qualified as being the equal of whites and should be treated as such.
Every time we see a Negro physician, it does us good. When we see a Negro pharmacist, it goes still better. When we see the lawyers, professors, bank presidents, inventors, machinists, mechanics, we grin as much as our mouth will allow and shout, "The Negro is coming." Editor, Richmond Planet.
AKA they were saying, "What's up, my nigga?"
Many whites feared since the end of slavery that blacks would come to feel they were equal to whites. Now that fear seemed realized.
The colored race is getting more unreliable. Freedom has ruined them in every way. Only the old-timey darkies can be trusted. The young ones are sullen and grow more insolent every day.
They don't sing as they used to. You should have known the old days of the plantation. Every year it seems they're losing more and more of their own confessed good humor. I sometimes feel I don't know them anymore. They've grown so glum and serious, or I'm free to say I'm scared of them.
Nowhere was this fear more pronounced.
And this is why all the mainstream political and media attacks are aimed at the youth. Because you got to control them when they're young. Tupac said, "Thug life stands for the hate you give little infants fucks everybody." Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than it is to rebuild weak men. So that's why there's such an attack on the children today now more than ever. Not just black children, all American children. See, back then they was doing really good with the black versus white. But in today's society, if you're an American, there's an attack on you and your children. Pay attention.
Than in Memphis, Tennessee, where in the 1880s, 40% of the population was black. Faced with this growing black presence, whites demanded that the informal practices, which had segregated the races since 1865, become legalized and strictly enforced.
The laws were intended to accomplish what it was clear the conventions were not going to accomplish, which was, again, to make African Americans act inferior. Again, if white people couldn't make African Americans be inferior, they couldn't prevent some of them from attaining a kind of middle-class status despite the violence and despite the discrimination, then they could make them act inferior.
These forced acts of humiliation began to manifest themselves on the Southern Railroad lines. Special Jim Crow cars were set aside on trains for black men and women, and for those white men who wanted to smoke and drink. In 1884, Ida B. Wells, a young teacher from Memphis, was quietly reading in a first-class car when the conductor ordered her to move to the Jim Crow car.
I refused, saying the forward car was a smoker and I was in the ladies' car. I proposed to stay. He tried to drag me out of my seat, but the moment he caught hold of my arm, I fastened my teeth on the back of his hand.
Shout out Ida B. Wells. She was pro Second Amendment, by the way.
But she refuses to go into that combination car. And she gets off the train, walks back to town with her dress torn, with her hat now askew. She will sue the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. She takes this mighty corporation to court, and she does prevail in the end, because the judge does say that indeed she was a lady. She's a school teacher. She was dressed the way she was supposed to dress. She acted accordingly.
But the victory was short-lived. The verdict was overturned by a Tennessee appeals court.
I had firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would give us justice. I feel shorn of that belief and utterly...
So far what we done learned is Andrew Jackson then played the masses of people. The Compromise of 1877 then played the masses of people. And now right here, you thought you had a victory and they hit you with another switch up.
Discouraged. If it were possible, I would gather the race in my arms and fly away with them. God, is there no redress, no peace, nor justice for us? Teach us what to do, for I am sorely, bitterly disgusted.
She said, I wanted so badly to do something great for my people, and I thought I had. But now, with this, I feel that that justice is no longer on our side.
Inspired by her personal confrontation with Jim Crow, Wells decided to fight for the rights of all black people. She taught school by day, and at night wrote newspaper articles under the pen name Iola. In the late 1880s, when the Tennessee legislature moved to take the vote away from blacks, Wells attacked.
The dailies of our city say that whites must rule this country, but this is an expression without a thought. The old Southern voice that made the Negroes.
You know, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And ain't it crazy? In 1880, they was trying to take voting rights away from black Americans, and now in 2023, they're still trying to make you think you're going to lose voting rights. Wake up, wake up, wake up. Disconnect from the matrix. Escape it.
Jump and run to their holes like rats is told to shut up. For the Negro of today is not the same as Negroes were 30 years ago.
Nah. They try to keep you in a state of fear. False evidence appearing real. Read for yourself, think for yourself, question everything.
But a black man or woman standing up for equal justice in 1892 was taking a serious risk. On the night of March 9th, when Wells was out of town, her friend Tom Moss and 2 others were jailed for defending themselves against several white men who had attacked Moss's grocery store. Masked vigilantes dragged Moss and his 2 friends from their cells to a deserted railroad yard. Before he died, Moss cried out, "Tell my people to flee. There is no justice here." This lynching, a term that came to be applied to any mob killing of blacks, disheartened Wells.
When she had come back to Memphis, she saw that the community was absolutely devastated, and so was she. No one knew quite what to do. But when she read those words, she said, this is going to be her mission as well. And she begins to tell black Memphians, there is no justice for you here. The system is not working for us. No one is trying to get these killers of our young men. And it is one we should go.
And go they did. At least 6,000 black Memphis residents would heed Wells's call to leave. It was the beginning of an exodus that in the coming decades would number in the millions. The murder of her friend also opened her eyes to who the true targets of the lynch mob were.
When her 3 friends were lynched, she began to realize that even black people, middle-class black people, could be victims of that. And she talks about how until that happened, she had believed that those excesses, what she called excesses against the race, were only directed against those people who had perhaps done something to deserve it.
You know, that's kind of fast forward to now. First off, Jay-Z made the story of OJ, which no matter where you're from, you viewed the same. But back then, as Ida B. Wells said, not growing up in the urban environment, she thought lynchings was just happening just because. Well, you fast forward today right now, and you got the people who don't live in the inner city. They say the violence is because of poverty. It's because of this issue. It's because of that issue. No. The same way back then, there was people externally looking, pointing fingers, trying to guess what the problems were. Nothing has changed in today's society. In Kansas City right now, Mayor Quentin Lucas is saying he don't know why violence is so bad. Yeah, Proverbs 18:21. It's loud and clear. You speak life or death. What's going on through the mainstream speakers of the masses of people? Study sound frequency. Study the laws of the universe. We are being played. We are being manipulated. And I don't need to physically control you if I can mentally control you. So free yourself from this mental slavery.
This opened my eyes to what lynching really was. An excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and
boom,
property, and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the niggers down.
Bingo. That's why I want to keep you on government programs. That's why I want Section 8. That's why I want handouts. I don't want you rising above the masses. I don't want you to show you can become anything, you accomplish anything. You're going to start giving these people hope. You're going to, as Lyndon Baines Johnson said, these niggas is getting too uppity. Pay attention to what's been going on. 1964, he said, I'm going to have these niggas vote Democrat the next 20 years. And then Obama show up in 2008 and hope and change. And Joe Biden in 2020 said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Man, look here. And I'm not saying pro-Republican because we've seen the compromise 1877. We've seen they've been manipulated. It's all been divide and conquer. We got to also know during the same time, it was a bunch of communist movements in the South. Read the book Hammer and Hoe. Read the book Black Slave Owners in South Carolina in the 1870s. Read for yourself, think for yourself, and then pick up a copy of The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson.
There's one voice that says that that these assumptions of black people, that we can actually come to some negotiated settlement with whites in this period, is a false assumption, and that you have to fight, that the only way we're going to do it is to fight.
That sounds like Malcolm.
Ida B. Wells would eventually leave Memphis for Chicago. There she began her crusade against the murder of Southern blacks, which she would continue for the rest of her life. But across the South, lynching continued. Edward White, Vance McClure,
and it wasn't about
Wagner,
crimes.
William,
it was about men that became wealthy, that rose above
Sherman,
the stereotypes.
John Fry, Ovid Belzer, William Smith, Falcon Francis, A.L. Smart, Mr. and Mrs. Morris, Patrick Morris, Gilbert Francis, Bird Love, Isaac Pizer, Louis Senegal, Joseph Dizel, Frank James, Louis Munn,
Gosh,
Hiram Whiteman, Tisano Lozano, Angelo Mongoso.
The tragedy today.
It got me thinking right now. If you could let me know in the comments below if you're still watching this video, how many black millionaires are there in today's society that don't walk around preaching the narrative of I'm a victim, it's hard being black America and white supremacy? Because it kind of ties together with what they say. And the lynching was to get the rich people who made it on their own. But how many modern day people do we have saying, hey, I got it out the mud, I did it on my own? Because Master P is still around. But all of the rappers who promoted to be self-made millionaires, I ain't never signed a label. Dolph, gone. Nipsey, gone. I'm sure it's more of them. We can keep thinking. XX Extension, I believe he was independent as well. But yeah, I'm sure y'all can let me know in the comments. But yeah, it seems like all the rappers that were self-made independent, they not here no more. And all the rappers who signed with the labels, the millionaires and the billionaires, they the ones saying it's hard being black. It's so hard. And then Kanye spoke out and nip. He disappeared off the face of the earth. So let me know, because it's kind of seeming like the way they was lynching individuals back then, and you fast forward, and it's like if you don't go along with that Hollywood script of I'm black and I'm oppressed, then you ain't going to get a check. But maybe that's just from my perspective. Once again, I'm just trying to learn and enlighten myself. So thank you for watching the video, and thank you for sharing your input as well.
I think there's a lot of people think they just hung somebody, but a ritualized lynching was a part of the culture of the South with even religious and patriotic connotations. Think about this. Some white folk, if they had the time, dressed up in their old army garb, their old army uniform, to come out to a lynching. Racism reached a point, it was so dramatized and so ritualized and codified in the laws and in the practices.
And something else I wanted to highlight, because we keep hearing them say the massive white people, and they were white back then, of course. But has there ever been a time when the massive people weren't controlled by the government? And I say that right now, most people repeat what they see on social media and on TV. Well, the algorithms are controlled on social media, and TV, someone controls what you see and when you see it. And you go before TV, we had the radio. Someone controlled what was on the radio and what you could and could not hear. And you go back before that, and someone controlled what you could read on the newspaper, what you could not read. So I just feel the masses of people have always been manipulated and bamboozled. Back then, they were manipulated to hate black people and look at us as inferior. Today, they're manipulated to look at us as still inferior, but in a different sense. Look at those poor black people who can't stop killing each other and can't conduct themselves in public. And so we have to be able to see that all sides of people have always been controlled by the government, by external information. That's why I say you got to read for yourself, think for yourself, talk to people from different backgrounds that have different perspectives of life, because we all live in a box, whether we know that or not.
That it was the most normal, patriotic, the most religious thing that you could do is to worship segregation.
But in the sea of violence, there were islands of hope. One was in the Mississippi Delta, a town called Mound Bayou.
There was no other place for me other than Mound Bayou. To me, it was the greatest place around. People could, we have our own officers.
And also, I need to drop Manning Johnson in there. He was the leader of the Hawaii Communist Party, and he wrote a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense, and that was during the 1950s as well, and he spoke of the communist concept of manipulating the masses of black people and destroying America as well. So check out Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson also.
I didn't have to walk down the street afraid.
This was something that was unbelievable in this very racial conscious era, where there was so few.
They still racial conscious, buddy. Ain't nothing changed.
For black people.
We had everything in Mount Bayou that heart could desire. We had oil mills, we had stores,
We had bottle works. We had hospitals. We had zoos. We had swimming pools. We had a lot of things that people would enjoy.
And they make it seem like black people ain't never had nothing but Black Wall Street.
Mound Bayou was founded in 1887.
1887?
By black businessman Isaiah T. Montgomery, a Southern man with a simple philosophy. It's a white man's country. Let them run it.
Isaiah Montgomery is a true American, and in a sense, he was extraordinarily opportunistic. Isaiah Montgomery had the ability to identify those individuals who had goods and services.
And this is why education is so important, because I'm sure Isaiah Montgomery, he has descendants. His family lineage possibly is still going. But we all educated through this school system to where if you live in America, from kindergarten to 12th grade, you can go to the best high school, come out with a 4.0, and you'll still see yourself as a second-class citizen. You will still think I'm less than because I'm black. And you go to college and they just double down on it. And all of it's false. Your skin color has nothing to do with how far you can go in life. Your sexual orientation has nothing to do with how far you can go in life. But our school system doesn't allow you to think. It actually kills your creativity. So read for yourself, think for yourself once again. And when you find information like this, as Malcolm X said, teach your children early what you learn late in life.
Some political power and esteem in the community and ingratiate himself with those persons.
I come from his lineage. We've
been
getting
Pap Singleton. Montgomery planned to create a safe harbor for blacks.
It was not easy to find settlers in the early days. The task of clearing a wild country seemed hopeless to men with so few resources and so little experience. Isaiah Montgomery.
The Delta of Mississippi in the mid-1880s was nothing more than a wilderness. These black people who came to the Mound Bayou area had to cut down trees, had to drain bayous, had to build up the land, had to fight off wild animals and snakes, and they lived as frontiersmen.
Man, we done got too comfortable. We sit on a couch with our iPhone ordering DoorDash.
Day by day, a town began to take shape. Churches, a post office, and schools replaced the forest.
My grandmother was Ada Simmons. She came here from Virginia. She wanted other than what she had been doing, the slavery and the people telling them what to do. She had in her mind that there must be something else. There must be something that was, better than what she was living under.
Unlike some black communities, the whites did not come in and destroy the community like some instances of other black communities. I believe because there was a notion that a separation of the races was an answer to the race problem.
By 1890, Mound Bayou was on its way to be...
I personally think forcing people to interact is negative. You don't have to force black and white. Frederick Douglass had a white wife, if I'm not mistaken. Booker T. Washington was biracial. But when you try to force anything on people, like right now how this pride stuff has been forced on people, it ain't gonna work. You let individuals do what they want and they mingle and eventually cross paths. But anything you try to force on me, if you got children, you try to force some vegetables on their plate, they gonna push it back. So trying to push a whole nother culture on the individual, it just ain't gonna work. And we gotta stop forcing society to do it. Nah, you do what you do, I do what I do, and we meet in the middle. We all Americans, and that's what we got in common. But what you do in the privacy of your bedroom, that ain't got nothing to do with me.
Becoming one of the most prosperous black communities in the country. The Jewel of the Delta, as it would later be called.
The Jewel of the Delta.
That year, Mississippi assembled a convention to pass its new Jim Crow Constitution. The only black delegate was Isaiah T. Montgomery.
Black people were looking for somebody that whites would accept. And so they elected Isaiah to go to this convention.
My mission is to offer an olive branch of peace to bridge a chasm that has been developing and widening for a generation that threatens destruction to you and yours, while it promises no enduring prosperity to me and mine.
Isaiah Montgomery, burning with desire to protect Mound Bayou from white intervention, agreed to vote in favor of an amendment to keep illiterates from voting. the law's real meaning was clear.
There is no use to equivocate or lie about the matter.
Got hustled again.
Mississippi's Constitutional Convention was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the nigger from politics. Not the ignorant, but the nigger. James Vardaman.
Mississippi whites cheered, but to black leaders, Montgomery was a traitor and a turncoat.
He has virtually said to the nation, you have done wrong in giving us this great liberty. He has surrendered part of his rights to an enemy who will make this surrender a reason for demanding all of his rights. He is not a conscious traitor, but his act is an act of treason. Treason for the cause of the colored people not only of his own state, but of the United States. Frederick Douglass.
Montgomery claimed the black vote was lost anyway. He hoped he had won a measure of safety for his people. Mound Bayou is the ship, he said. All else is an open, raging, tempestuous sea. While many black leaders, like Douglass, were outraged by Montgomery's vote, Booker T. Washington was not. By the 1890s, Washington's reputation as a spokesperson and fundraiser for Tuskegee was growing.
Booker T. Washington spoke in a language that everyone could understand. He had something for working class blacks. He had something for middle class blacks. He was able to, therefore, to control black businessmen. He was able to control black churchmen who admired the gospel success that he was articulating. And he was able to win the admiration of working class blacks who saw that all other alternatives had now been essentially exhausted.
Booker was nobody's fool. The Carnegies and the other benefactors of Tuskegee would not have contributed a dime if he, at that moment, had offered a threat to the existence that these wealthy white men were perpetuating.
Across the South, black improvement seemed to be thwarted at every turn, and violence continued as a daily threat. Booker T. Washington searched for a compromise that might bring racial peace. His opportunity came in 1895 when he was invited to speak at the Cotton Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. September 25th was proclaimed Negro Day, but the black press tried to discourage blacks from attending.
If Negroes wish to feel that they are inferior to other American citizens, if they want to see all sides, signs that say, for whites only, or...
You know what I'm getting from this documentary is that black people always been fighting with black people, and white people always been fighting with black people. I mean, with white people, sorry. Just they've been infighting with each other, and then it's just been a bunch of fighting and trying to control other people. Man, just history doesn't change, but it often repeats itself in some way, shape, or form, and this is crazy to witness.
No niggers or dogs allowed. If they want to be humiliated and have their man and womanhood crushed out, then come. Editor, Atlanta Voice.
James Creelman, a correspondent for the New York World, observed the crowd turn hostile when Washington mounted the speaker's platform.
When a colored man appeared on stage, a sudden chill fell on the whole assemblage. One after another asked, "What's that nigger doing on the stage?" James Creelman.
But when Booker T. Washington criticized his own people for seeking political and economic power during Reconstruction, the crowd listened.
Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than to spend $1 in an opera house. Booker T. Washington.
And when he held his dusky hand high above his head with the fingers stretched apart and said to the white people of the South on behalf of his race, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the finger, yet one as the hand. In all things essential to mutual progress," a great sound wave resounded from the walls, and the whole audience was on its feet in a delirium of applause. When the Negro finished, such an ovation followed as I had never seen before and never expect to see again. White Southern women pulled flowers from the bosom of their dresses and rained them upon the stage. Tears ran down the face of the many blacks in the audience.
As news of Washington's speech began to spread, many in the black community wondered, had Washington chosen to compromise their human rights in exchange for racial peace and economic stability? This generated overwhelming feelings of confusion, disappointment, even anger. But the white press across America rushed to embrace Washington's views. Former abolitionists, railroad tycoons, political leaders, even President Grover Cleveland wired their congratulations.
Grover Cleveland, the 22nd president of the United States, said, and I quote, "Any sensible and logical woman would never want to vote." Just showing how history changes and people switch their perspective on life. And if you've watched this video, once again, I hope that some of the concepts that you heard, they aren't offensive, because we have an extremely sensitive society right now. And this isn't to make anybody feel offensive or shock you, but we need to understand where we come from so we can see why the media is able to manipulate the masses at such a high level still in 2023.
No black leader had ever before so eloquently defended Jim Crow. The speech would be celebrated as the Atlanta Compromise.
I think
See, before this documentary, I had never heard of the Atlanta Compromise as defending Jim Crow. So I learned something new as well.
Washington's idea of getting civil rights.
Jesse Lee Peterson said
if
Jim
you
Crow
look
wasn't
like,
terrible, though.
act like, achieve like, work like, own businesses like, support the government like, pay taxes like everybody else, that the civil rights that you are entitled to will be given to you.
The South had demonstrated this was not the case. Only 12 months after the Atlanta Compromise, the highest court in the land would agree. 3 years before the Washington speech, a Louisiana shoemaker named Omer Plessy was fined $25 for refusing to leave a whites-only car on the Louisiana Railway. Plessy was only 1/8 black, but under Louisiana law, he was black. By 1896, the case appeared before the United States Supreme Court. The court upheld the Louisiana law, stating that separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites did not violate the Constitution's new guarantee of equal protection.
So if you was biracial, they didn't protect you? Is that how it worked?
Only 3 decades earlier, the end of slavery had been the promise of a new day for black Americans, in which they could earn their livelihood by their own freely chosen labor, educate their children, participate in government, and receive equal justice under the law. But despite the remarkable advances, those hopes were now dashed. Jim Crow was the law of the land, North and South, and so it would remain for half a century. Abandoned by the North, without allies in the South, blacks continued to struggle for their freedom, relying on their families, churches, schools, and other organizations to sustain them.
Relying on their families, churches, schools, and other organizations to sustain them. Do you see why there's such an attack on the family in America? Not just for black people, but for all people. You see why there's such an attack on the churches and on the schools? Because that's what the backbone was. Is when you could not count on the government to protect you or look out for you, at least you had the people around you. So do not let you or your mama, your daddy, your brother, your sister, don't let your family be divided over politics, whether you voted for Trump or Biden or Democrat or Republican, because that's the goal. The goal is to divide you from the people around you, so you have to depend on the government. We need strong families and we need strong communities now more than ever.
For black Americans, no time
black,
since the
white,
end of
Hispanic,
slavery
Asian, Chinese,
so dark.
Japanese, Puerto Rico, whatever. If you didn't come from a strong family, make sure a strong family come from you. Man,
the tragic
all right. This was part 1 of the rise and fall of Jim Crow. I'm gonna put this video up on on the internet. And whenever y'all watch it, let me know in the comments if you want me to do part 2, part 3, and part 4. And like I said, this is all just to learn. You know, you hear everybody say, you need to educate yourself. Educate yourself. That's all I'm trying to do. This ain't to offend nobody. This ain't to attack nobody. It's just to learn and grow and share wisdom far and wide, baby. Have a super mega awesome day. Never be too proud to pray. And stay in a state of happiness and gratitude because blessings are always on the way. We outie. Peace.